Injured dog guided veteran to remote cabin. The secret inside shocked him. The first sound wasn't the wind but a pattern. 3 frantic scratches, a pause, then one, as if a code hammered on wood. James froze. The blizzard leaned into the cabin. When he unbarred the door, the night poured in. Knives of snow and a German shepherd that stumbled across the threshold and folded at his boots. Blood soaked the dog's shoulder. Rope fibers ridged the raw skin beneath a dented brass tag. The eyes locked on him, fierce and lucid, then flicked toward the dark outside, unblinking. The dog tried to stand, failed and drove a desperate whine through its teeth. He lifted the dog to the stove, hands moving on old muscle memory, water, towels, pressure, breath. The tag said Max. Max wouldn't settle. He stared through the door as if the storm were only a thin curtain and something behind it were burning a hole in the world. Every few heartbeats, a sound shivered out of him, half whine, half warning, always followed by a twitch in one torn ear, always north. James cracked the door. Cold punched his lungs. In the snowfield, fresh tracks staggered toward the tree line and stopped. No return trail, no wind-smeared drift, as if something had lifted the dog and set him down again. Far out in the white, a single ember of light blinked, died, blinked again. Not fire, not star, a rhythm James felt in the scar tissue under his ribs. 3, pause, 1. Max scraped the floorboards, frantic, then pressed his head into James's palm as if swearing him in. Under the fur, the tremor wasn't fear, it was urgency with a destination. Outside, the night breathed like a live thing. Snow hissed at the threshold, daring him to cross it. What secret was Max trying to reveal? What happened next will shock you. James came to the mountains to practice forgetting. At 38 he carried ghosts that never tired, a vigilance that made sleep feel like a perimeter rather than rest. When his Uncle Thomas died, the deed to a weathered log cabin passed to the nephew who had sent brief letters from overseas and then from bases that never kept one name long. He drove until the plows turned back, left the truck by a frozen creek and hiked 2 miles through firs that crowded the track like silent witnesses. The first sight of the place looked exactly like the envelope promised, hand-hewn logs with the dark gloss of old smoke, a roof patched with tin, a stone chimney leaning a stubborn inch. The door stuck in winter, and the hinges argued but the latch held. Inside, a stove with an iron belly stood on slate, a table scarred by knives, shelves wearing jars of nails and screws, and a cot built against the wall. Thomas had favored usefulness over polish and usefulness had survived. James stacked wood by the stove, swept out mouse pellets and sat until his breath matched the room's quiet. Photos of Thomas hung in crooked frames, a grinning boy with a fish, a middle-aged man on snowshoes, an old-timer holding a chainsaw like a trophy, the same lopsided grin carried through decades. That unbothered smile could steady a person if they let it. The clearing sat inside a ring of pines tall enough to sing even when the wind only toyed with them. A spring house slumped near the tray line, and a shed leaned toward it like a brother mid-whisper. Beyond, ridges ran like the backs of sleeping animals under quilts of white. The cabin's bones didn't creak unless the weather insisted, and the stove warmed faster than memory. James laid out the few things that made a life: a coffee tin, a blackened kettle from years, a worn field knife, a small kit rolled in canvas, and a notebook with half the pages filled by lists he could not throw away. He liked the predictability of chores: cut wood, carry water, seal drafts, inventory supplies, check the roof, grease the latch. The day answered with clear, cold light that turned breath into smoke and made distant ravens look like ash falling upward. Montana winter made conversation unnecessary. Snow pressed into every seam, turning ridges into white shoulders under a low sky. On calm days the cold felt clean, and the only sounds were an axe counting blows and ravens trading news from tree to tree. On storm days the wind drilled through notches and came howling like freight, stamping the roof, clawing shutters, dragging ghost voices through every gap he had stuffed with burlap. He learned that silence could weigh more than noise. Even the stove ticked like a metronome for patience. The cabin's simplicity calmed him because nothing inside demanded interpretation. The land did not ask questions he could not answer. He wrote a line to Thomas in the notebook, out of habit, Made it, thanks, fixing the north shutter tomorrow. To write was not to send, yet it mattered. By late afternoon the sky lowered until it met the trees. Wind erased the tracks he had left at noon. The barometer dropped without mercy. He checked shutters, stacked kindling, topped a lantern with kerosene, and set stew to simmer. Frost feathered the inside of the pane. The ridge answered in a deep growl as gusts poured down the saddle and slammed the gable. He listened with the old attention trained in tents and briefing rooms, parsing tones the way a medic parses breath. He did not think about names, he only spoke in the dark. He thought about stoves and wood and doors and whether the rafters would complain in the night. Snow began as powder and then arrived with weight, a white insistence that buried, smothered, simplified. Storms did not frighten him, they simply measured a person. He stepped outside to clear a drift at the door, and the air slashed his lungs until he coughed and laughed at the same time. Snow found every seam. He shoveled a notch, pushed back the weight, retreated, and bolted the door with the satisfaction of a task finished. The stove ticked as resin popped. Pine smoke settled into the beams. He ate slowly, rationing heat and light. He said Thomas's name once and let it dissolve. The old man's photograph watched him with that slight grin that could belong to confidence or mischief. James didn't try to decide which. The night came in one movement. Wind climbed an octave and stayed there, a blade held to the throat of the valley. James set another log, banked the coals, and kept his mind away from memories he preferred to handle by the edge. A sound interrupted the storm's monologue, 3 urgent scratches on the door, a pause, then one. He stilled because patterns travel faster than words. He lifted the lantern, listened, heard only the gale, and nearly sat before the sequence came again, fainter, as if a code knocked from the other side of the weather. Training put him at the door with the bar in his hand before he finished thinking. Snow pushed into the room in a hissing sheet, and with it a German shepherd emerged from the white, stumbled and dropped at his boots. The coat steamed, blood soaked the shoulder and stiffened in the rough. Rope had burned grooves into the neck above a dented brass tank. The dog raised its head long enough to find James's eyes and hold them with an intensity that did not beg for pity. Purpose lived there. Then the head turned toward the door, toward the storm. A sound rose from the chest, thin and steady, more message than James shut the door and lowered to a knee. The old kit that never leaves a medic's hands unfolded from memory: assess, control bleeding, protect airway, stabilize. He spread a blanket by the stove, lifted carefully, and eased the weight onto warm. He spoke in a quiet tone that steadied breath without making promises. A bowl of water, a strip of cloth, a small bottle of tincture, pressure applied exactly where the gash widened, and a bandage tied with knots that would not slip. He cut away rope fibers and washed grit from the wound, dabbing until the blood slowed to an ooze. The brass tag took a thumbprint to clean. Letters surfaced: Mex. The name fit the head, the build, the training visible even in distress. The room settled into 2 heartbeats, and the storm. Pine smoke, wet dog, iron and stew tangled into one smell. Max's breathing steadied, yet alertness stayed coiled under ribs, a readiness that refused sleep. Each time James checked the bandage, the gaze slid past him toward the door, then a few degrees right, as if sight could tunnel through snow to something waiting in the dark. The posture was familiar. He had seen it on point men, reading air for wire, on pilots scanning cloud for threat, on himself when a call might come through any second, and send a unit into the night. He fed the stove, watched the flames climb, and recognized a truth as simple as heat: the animal had not come here by chance. Wind raged, withdrew, returned. Frost retreated from the window nearest the stove and crept along the far pane. Hinges chattered, rafters groaned. The cabin spoke its language, and he understood. He made coffee strong and took inventory aloud, a habit that kept nerves from inventing trouble. Wood good, water good, lamp good, first aid good, rifle clean. He set a second bowl with jerky softened in broth. Max ignored it, listening to the gale with hard concentration. Every few minutes a taut whine surfaced, clipped short, followed by the tilt of one torn ear as if measuring distance. James cracked a shutter an inch. White absorbed the lantern glow and gave nothing back. No tree, no fence, no track, only a motionless vapor that made the world feel irregular. He closed it and felt the wind press harder, seeking a mistake, Questions crowded the room and would not form answers. Who tied the rope? How far did the dog travel? Why is there no returning trail? He checked vitals again, adjusted the wrap and laid a hand between the ears. The skull felt warm, alive, intent. Max steadied under the touch, but the muscles held a thread of tension, a line that led somewhere beyond the ridge. Time thin. He filled the stove, mended a glove, wrote a line in the notebook. Storm at peak, shepherd found, severe laceration, rope abrasions, then paused over a phrase he did not want to write, cause unknown. He disliked the unknown. He lived by maps, yet he also understood signals when they repeat. 3 scratches, pause, 1, tracks that would already be gone, a gaze returning to the same axis, unshaken by pain or comfort. Without deciding, he slid the rifle from its rack, checked the action, and leaned it within reach, not as a threat but as an acknowledgement. Outside, the storm hammered onward while Max watched the door, listening for a signal only he seemed able to hear. Morning edged in dull silver, and James woke to measured breathing by the stove. Max lifted his head when the kettle whispered, ears alert despite the bandage, amber eyes tracking every movement with steady vigilance. The first day passed in care, warm broth coaxed between clenched jaws. A fresh wrap, snow melted for water, shutters checked while the shepherd rested. By evening the dog could sit, ribs rising with less strain, gaze anchored on the door as wind pressed its weight against the walls. James spoke little, letting tone carry reassurance, hands working from habit that once steadied bleeding men under rotor wash. The storm eased overnight, leaving bone-white glare. On the second morning Max tried to stand, wobbled, planted himself and refused to lie down. He paced the narrow run between cot and threshold, nails clicking, pausing to stare north through a sliver between boards. A thin sound rose from his throat, not pain but urgency. James told himself it was shock, a reflex from whatever nightmare had burned rope into the neck and cut a valley along the shoulder. He tightened the bandage, set a bowl and watched the dog ignore food to study the seam of light edging the door. James held the line on routine anyway, split rounds, sweep ash, inventory tins. Max followed like a shadow, pressing close when he turned toward the north wall, pulling back whenever he drifted south, as though a magnet lived under the snow line. That night, sleep came in broken lengths. Before dawn, 3 distant cracks rose above the gale. Maybe ice sheared from the ridge, maybe trees gave under load, but Max lifted at the first, tilted at the second, and fixed on the third with certainty. James felt heat slide along nerves he kept coiled, the old readiness that could make a body move before thought. He banked the fire and watched gray bloom at the pane. On the third day, strength returned in quick steps. Max ate with appetite, then resumed pacing, circling and orienting, always pausing at the same angle. The bandage stayed clean, the gait steadied, yet the agitation did not fade, it refined. The shepherd learned the room like a map, and rejected all routes that did not end at the door. James set the rifle on the table, not as a threat but as an acknowledgement that choices might come. With the light full over the pines he cracked the shutter. Snow stretched unmarked except for faint depressions from earlier work. Max stood statue still, nose high, drawing scent with measured pulls, then gave a short decisive chuff toward the tray line. James shut the shutter and met a gaze that was not pleading or grateful, simply insistent. He tried explanations that would let him stay: concussion, habit, training without a handler, none fit. He had met panic, and he had met purpose. This was the second, wearing a dog's body. Max lay by his boots only to rise minutes later and resume the slow path. Click, turn, look north. Why? The dog answered with a glance toward the door that carried a rebuttal cleaner than speech. Twilight gathered early, iron blue and final. James set another log and let the rhythm of chores drown the debate building behind his teeth. He had driven here for silence, for distance from calls that could bend a week into an hour. Yet the cabin had become an instrument, and Max kept plucking the same string until it thrummed in bone. In the small hours he woke to nails on wood and a nose against his rib. The shepherd had climbed onto the cot with deliberate care, planted a paw across his forearm like a pledge, and held his eyes until the idea of solitude felt like a lie. Dawn of the fourth day came hard and bright. James checked the wound, found the edges knitting, changed the wrap, and opened the door to the shovel. Cold burned the throat. Max stood in the doorway, weight forward, tail rigid, every line speaking, and James read the message, though he refused to translate. Later the wind rose and snow sprinted across the clearing like phantom rivers. The shepherd resumed his circuit with new impatience, shouldering James's knee when he paused too long, pushing him toward boots and park. Have you ever felt a call you couldn't ignore, a pull toward something greater? The question arrived without invitation, an old thought that had once shoved him through doors marked danger and carried him back with strangers whose names he learned only after liftoff. He looked at the dog and almost laughed, then didn't. He tried practical reasons to wait. Whiteouts killed travelers who thought bravery equalized physics. Equipment failed, maps lied when drifts hid landmarks. Still the gaze kept returning to one bearing, and refusal thin. He tested gear anyway, mitts dry, spare socks rolled, stove fuel full, paracord coiled, headlamp bright, radio charged, though reception rarely cooperated this deep. Max watched each item land on the table as if inventory confirmed a plan long since chosen. The tail never wagged. This was not a celebration, it was a ceremony. By evening the sky bruised back to slate. James stacked extra wood, tightened the last shutter, and lashed the latch, so gusts could not pry it. He ate, rinsed the cup, and weighed retreat against responsibility. Quiet could be as addictive as adrenaline, and both could ruin judgment. The trick lay in hearing the right voice beneath either thrill. Max settled on the threshold with the patience of a sentry. Snow hissed, rafters ticked, the world waited. On the fifth morning the shepherd woke him before light by rapping a paw against the bunk frame. James rose without a word. He dressed for an approach he had not admitted he would make. Heavy coat, wool layers, gaiters, scarf, hat pulled low, pack loaded with essentials, rifle slung. While he worked, Max sat perfectly still, tracking steps with bright eyes as if assigning tasks. When James knelt to check the wrap, the dog leaned into the pressure without flinching, and then lifted his chin toward the door, a simple command written in braille. James hesitated longer than the gesture deserved. He looked at photographs of Thomas, at the tilt of that old grin, and understood that safety had never been the family currency. It had always been service, stubborn as the chimneys. He ran risk calculus like an officer filing a report to himself: limited visibility, unknown distance, possible threat, single ally, high motivation. The numbers weren't friendly, yet every time he finished the math, the same conclusion settled, not forced by the dog, not imposed by guilt, but grown from whatever remained of duty. He opened the logbook and wrote a line for anyone who might find it: North Trail, following guide, back by dark if possible. He closed the book, slid it under the lamp, and stood. Max rose in the same instant and touched his nose to James's palm, sealing an understanding forged over hours of care and watch. Then the dog carried that pack to the door, sat and stared into the storm until the wind itself seemed to pause to listen. James drew breath, and reached forward. James sealed the logbook, checked the latch, and shrugged into the heavy coat whose wool collar smelled of smoke and cold iron. Gaiters cinched, scarf wrapped, hat pulled low. He slung the pack, lifted the rifle, and stood with the practiced calm of a man who had rehearsed risk until it felt like routine. Max waited by the door, amber eyes bright, body coiled with intent. James slid the bar, the gale shouldered through, flinging snow like ground glass. He stepped out first so the dog would not vanish into a drift, shut the door, and let Max take point. Tracks blurred as soon as they formed under spindrift moving like living fog, but the shepherd read currents he could not see and drove toward the northern trees. Steps sank to the shin, then the knee, in hollows where wind piled powder into deceptive troughs. Pines crowded close, black ribs in white flesh, crowns whispering as gusts combed needles into a ceaseless shiver. Air knifed through wool, freezing tears at the corners of his eyes. Max trotted ahead, pausing to lift his nose and taste the wind, then angling left or right with purpose. James kept an interval, reading the dog like a moving compass while scanning for deadfall, avalanche bowls and thin ice hidden beneath innocuous crust. Muffled notes rose from buried creeks to warn of weak places. The first crossing came where the current kept a black ribbon away. Max tested, retreated, and led downstream to a narrow shaded by alder roots. James spread his weight, slid one boot at a time, and listened for the drum of hollow space. Cracks, spidered but held. On the far bank the dog nosed a wind-carved lip and set off again, tail low, ears pricked north. Old Cadence returned, speed balanced with caution, breath with muscle, attention with thrift. He watched roofs and alleys once. Now he watched slope angles, tree lean, snow texture and silences that meant more than noise. The valley felt indifferent, as if the land recognized them only as heat and weight passing over a ledger of cold. Max halted, the wind veered and he shifted a few degrees east. James marked the change on his inner map and trusted. Trust felt like a muscle rebuilding, small fiber by fiber. Every time the dog glanced back to confirm his partner still followed, brush thickened into a cage of young firs. Max threaded openings while James shouldered through, pack snagging on brittle twigs. Boot soles found hidden logs, balance recovered. Sweat cooled instantly when he paused, slicing with chill that punished hesitation. He adjusted layers and reset the sling so it would not catch if he fell. Under older growth, footing improved, trunks rose like columns, wind funneled into a steady roar. At a fallen pine, the dog pawed until bark showed old claw gouges not made by him, sniffed, gave a soft sound and moved on. Half a mile later the ridge lifted. Cornices guarded the right edge. The left fell away into a white void where spruce tips pricked a blank page. Max rejected the lip and climbed into dense trees, trading exposure for shelter. Snow cascaded as he tunneled. James widened the slot with his shoulder. Thighs burned, calves knotted, lungs worked like bellows. He counted steps to pace effort and rested at set numbers to keep discipline honest. From the crest, the forest rolled north in frozen waves, a vastness that made the cabin feel imaginable. Max stood against the glare like a herald, then dropped into a trough where ice had skinned a stream into glass. James probed with the rifle butt, found thickness and placed each boot precisely in the dog's prints. On the far side a game trail ran under snow like a hallway. Pine sap froze into amber beads. Max sniffed resin, then stared ahead with unblinking focus. What would you risk for someone, or something you barely know? The thought slid between breaths like a tap. He listed risks as if briefing a squad: exposure, terrain traps, unknown contact, weak comms, finite light. The list argued not for retreat, but for moving smart. At a fork the wind pulled two plumes across the snow in opposing directions. Max swung left, then right, then centered on the eastern option, and committed. James marked a bent sapling with a strip of orange tape, a breadcrumb glowing against white. Trees thinned into a meadow drowned under white, bordered by willow wands that rattled. Max crossed in a straight line, stepping on humps where buried grass held crust. He matched the pattern. Beyond, terrain funneled into a chute crammed with old snow and broken limbs. Max crawled, glanced back. James read the cue, clipped a line to his pack, and dragged it like a sled to keep his center low. Every foot forward demanded a calculation followed by commitment. The dog tested, shifted, repeated, never gambling. The chute spilled onto a bench walled by spruce. Max froze, ears high, nose cutting a small arc, then pushed on with renewed urgency. James felt the pace change like a hand at his spine. Something ahead tightened the line between guide and goal. The bench narrowed to a slot where rock shouldered through snow like vertebrae. A gust carried a smell both sharp and stale, tinged with smoke too thin to declare itself. Max whined once, low and brief, then surged. Younger trees returned, packed tight, making a tunnel green as seawater. Frost furred every needle. The passage looked built from glass. They reached another creek, narrow and fast, capped by plates that looked strong until inspected. Max rejected 3 spots, found a log with snow piled along its crown, tested, then paced across with balletic precision. James crouched, centered his weight, used the rifle as a balance bar, and followed with breaths timed to steps. On the far bank he scanned and confirmed he could defend if defense became necessary, though against what he could not see. Light thinned, the sky darkened, a shade without the sun moving, a trick of weather that stole time. Max looked back, not to question but to count. Partnership had become explicit, small signals read, adjustments made without complaint. The dog had not asked for rescue, he had recruited an ally. The trail bent around a shoulder of stone that shrugged drifts like a bull shakes flies. Beyond, a bowl opened, wind scoured and bare, bounded by pines leaning as if listening to something buried in the distance. Max paused at the lip, scanned the horizon and gave a single bark, not alarm but declaration. James lifted binoculars, studied the line where trees met white, and caught a thread that might have been smoke, then lost. Max did not lose anything. He cut a diagonal across the bowl using firm patches like stepping stones. Awe and dread collided in James's chest like fronts. The world had no stake in them. It existed, immense and cold, while two small lives drew a line upon. The dog's unwavering focus became the one warmth that mattered. Whatever lay at the end of that line kept calling, and the call entered him like a second heart. He tightened his gloves, squared his shoulders, and followed into the merciless white, convinced the destination waited just beyond the next fold, and that whatever they found would make the storm behind them seem gentle by comparison. Max crested the last wind-scoured bowl and halted on a ridge of buried roots, nose lifted, body angled like an arrow. Beyond the spruce a tight clearing opened. In the center stood a crooked cabin, boards silvered by years of frost, porch slumped, shingles missing like. A brick chimney rose from the rear wall, and above it a thread of smoke unspooled into gray. James lowered his binoculars. The pull that had carried him over miles of drift tightened in his chest. Max looked back once, then slid downhill, choosing a shelf the wind had scoured clean. Snow lay smooth around the structure, untracked except for a narrow lane along the lee side. The dog took that path without pause. James scanned for wire, glint, shadow, anything that said eyes watched through slats. At the steps a rank sweetness rode over the smell of cold smoke. Max's hackles lifted. He tapped the porch in a hard staccato and clawed the door, frantic as if the wood were a wound. A brass padlock stuck through a hasp bolted across the jamb. The screws looked new against lifeless wood. James touched the lock, then held still, listening. Under the wind he caught a sound, a long breath ending in a hitch, then silence. Max barked once, a clipped note that carried urgency without panic. Have you ever stumbled on a truth that changed everything? James slung the rifle, set his pry bar under the hasp plate and leaned. The first screws turned a sliver, then seized. He shifted tools and brought the rifle butt down on the padlock. Impact rang through the porch. A second strike folded the shackle. A third split the hasp. The door pressed inward against something heavy. He wedged fingers into the gap and heaved. A timber scraped across the floor. He slid the bar aside and pushed through. Cold air breathed out. Stale heat breathed back, carrying metal, mildew, damp wool, and a sweet sour note. He clicked his chest lantern. The beam found two boarded windows, seams stuffed with rags. A squat stove sulked in one corner. A table leaned against a wall, legs roped. Cans stood in ranks, labels wiped. A chair lay on its side. Max ranged left, nose low, tail stiff, following a scent that snaked around the stove and died near the back wall. The light swung with him, and stopped on a doorway curtained by a quilt. James parted the fabric with the back of his wrist. The smaller room held a single bed under a plywood-sealed window. The chain ran from an eye bolt sunk into a stud, crossed a floor scarred by drag marks, and ended in a cuff locked around the wrist of an elderly woman. Her hair, mostly white with iron at the roots, lay matted to a brow, filmed with sweat. Cheeks had collapsed into planes. Lips were split at the center. Collarbones stood above a chest rising in shallow, uncertain breaths. The smell sharpened. Urine and wool, a whisper of antiseptic, infection under blankets. A tin cup on a crate held a rind of ice. James set the rifle against the wall, and dropped to a knee so she wouldn't look up. He said his name in the gentle, exact voice he had used with men pulled from wreckage. The eyelids lifted a fraction. Her eyes slid past him to Max. The dog rested his chin on the blanket near her hand. Her voice arrived as paper tearing. No more, she breathed. The chain clinked when she tried to raise her arm. The cuff had chewed the wrist raw. James checked pupils, counted a thready pulse, pressed a fingertip to the back of her hand, and watched color creep reluctantly into blanching skin. He shortened the plan: water, heat, release. He poured lukewarm sips from the kettle, tested and lifted the cup. She swallowed carefully and slumped. He opened the stove vent and fed a log. He set the lantern where iron could throw light. Max stayed with his chin by her fingers, body still as a wall. His eyes kept flicking to the chain. The cuff wanted a key. None waited on the crate, the shelf, or the peg coat's pockets. James crossed to the main room, searched drawers, a coffee tin of screws under the table and the floor for a glint. No key. He knelt by the wrist again and studied the mechanism. Not police hardware, a farm shackle repurposed. A hinge pin could be drifted if he worked slowly. He set the screwdriver to the pin and tapped with the knife's back. The cylinder grudged forward a hair. He adjusted the angle, tapped again. While he worked, he catalogued the room. A mirror cracked but wiped clear. A ledger with neat dates. Wood stacked to a fixed measure. A cup under the bed with a faint lipstick print. Drag scars in arcs like a clock. The pin eased halfway and stuck. He breathed, shifted grip, tapped. It slid. The cuff sprang open with a small sigh. The woman jerked once and then went still, breathing in a rhythm that belonged to relief mixed with pain. "Eleanor," she said, voice thin but decisive. James wrapped the wrist with gauze and worked the blood back until the gray turned to mottled pink. He checked ankles and found a matching bruise where a second shackle had rubbed, though that cuff lay open like a threat left for later. He asked how long with nods and blinks. 1 for days, 2 for weeks, 3 for months. She blinked twice and turned her. A thud whispered from the main room, the wind or dread, turning silence into noise. He listened, then moved with quick care. He set a pot for broth, layered blankets, and positioned the lantern, so warmth and light could work. Max stood between bed and doorway, a barrier of wood. Marks near the threshold told a missing story, grooves from the bar, scuffs from boots, a dark heel-shaped stain. The smoke thread outside faltered, strengthened, faltered again. He returned to Eleanor, gave another sip, then paused. Under grim her face showed stubborn bones. Her fingers found Max's fur and held. The horror didn't shout, it whispered through petty order. Canned peaches are aligned. A broom weighted with bristles trimmed flat. The quilt curtain had been mended with thread matched to faded squares. James knew that control. He had seen men arrange objects because they could not arrange souls. He packed anger into a cold, precise corner and kept his voice low. "We're here," he said. "You're safe for now." She gave the smallest nod. Max let out a sound so low it vibrated more than travel. Wind shifted, and the chimney sang a thin note. The forest felt alert, as if the clearing had exhaled and something in the trees inhaled. James lifted his rifle, checked the chamber and listened to the hush lean against the boarded window. He understood that finding her was only the first hinge. The next would swing louder. Night pressed on the clearing. Max didn't look. Night gathered itself outside, ready to step through the space where a lock had failed. The chain fell away, and Eleanor's breath slowed to a thin thread while Max planted himself between the bed and the doorway, every muscle wired, ears forward, tail stiff as a spear. A boot thudded on the porch, then another, and the latch jumped. The door crashed inward on a gust of needles, and a man shouldered through the snow haze, coat crusted white, beard matted, eyes bright with a feverish glitter that went straight to the open cuff on the floor. He carried a crowbar and a canvas sack that clinked. "Step back," he barked, voice rough with cold and rage. James read the stance, the spread feet, the crowbar held like a lever-turned weapon. "Nathan," Eleanor whispered, fear and fury braided into a single worn syllable. The name hung in the stale air like a verdict. "Nephew," James said evenly, placing him in the same bones as the old photographs on the wall, stripped of grace, stuffed with need. Nathan sneered without humor. "She'd freeze or starve without me," he said, but the tone wasn't care, it was property. Max's growl rose from his chest like a low engine, controlled, steady, promising motion if the man advanced. Snow hissed against the boarded windows. James shifted slightly to keep the stove to his left, the bed behind his right shoulder, the rifle down but visible. "You chained an elder," he said. "You padlocked the door from outside." Nathan's hand tightened on the crowbar. "You don't know what you've walked into," he snapped. "There's money, there's land, papers that say who holds what. She can't be trusted." She tried to leave. The canvas sack knocked his thigh. Coins or brass rattled inside. Max edged forward, placing himself on a line that blocked the path to Eleanor. Nathan's gaze darted to the stove, to the kettle, to the lantern, measuring ways to blind or burn. "You open that shackle any further and I swear I'll," he lunged. James moved first, driving the muzzle into the crowbar to divert the arc and pivoting his weight so steel scraped iron instead of skull. The lantern skidded, flared, toppled, and the glass shattered across the plank floor. A tongue of flame licked spilled fuel, shimmered, and caught the frayed rug near the stove. Heat bloomed with terrifying speed. Nathan swung wildly, the bar clipping James's forearm. Pain rang up to the shoulder, but training cut through shot. He stepped inside the swing, slammed the rifle stock into Nathan's hip, and hooked the crowbar with his free hand. Max erupted, not biting but blasting sound and force into Nathan's legs, shouldering him sideways so that he missed the bed. Eleanor flinched but didn't scream. Her eyes burned with a lucid fury that outlived hunger. Flames crawled along the rug, kissed kindling, and then the stove's ash lip belched a gust that threw sparks like hornets. The quilt curtain darkened, then lightened at the edges, as heat found dust. Air thinned and changed taste, a bitter metallic layer over damp wool. Nathan backed toward the table, face twisted, then drove forward again with the crowbar high. James ducked, the bar tore splinters from a shelf and cans clattered. He drove a shoulder into Nathan's ribs, and both of them slammed against the far wall. The crowbar fell. Nathan grabbed the rifle and yanked. The sling caught, the barrel scraped along a nail, and both men lost purchase for a second. That cost too much. The curtain flashed at the hem. Fire raced up patchwork seams, hungry for old thread. Smoke rolled across the ceiling and rebounded. Max barked sharp, short, urgent. One. Pause. One. Again, cutting through chaos like a metronome for survival. James shoved Nathan away and went for Eleanor, because triage doesn't bargain. "We're leaving," he said to her, voice pitched low, steady, command tied to promise. He slid an arm beneath shoulders light as twigs, lifted and felt bone through blanket, felt the fragile heat of a life that needed air. Nathan lunged again, fingers clawing for the blanket, spitting words about deeds, heirs, signatures, probate, all the reasons people break under the weight of paper. In a moment of crisis, what would you fight to protect? James's mind answered without words. Breath, warmth, a heartbeat that had endured chains. He turned so his back took the blow meant for her, staggered and kept moving. Max hammered the floor with his paws, barking a path, pivoting toward the hallway, then the main room, then the door, counting steps with sound. Flames found the wall and raced sideways, seeking every dry seam. The stove roared like a jet on idle. The air went orange, then brown. James crouched to keep Eleanor below the hottest layer and pulled the blanket over her face to filter the smoke. Nathan grabbed for the door, then spun and seized the canvas sack, tearing the mouth open to check whatever glinted within. Greed bending reason. The delay sealed his choice. The ceiling crackled. Nails pinged from heated boards. A joist boomed. Pressure punched the room as an upper window blew behind the plywood. Snow surged inward through the half-broken door and turned instantly to steam. Max dodged falling cinders and kept barking, an audible rope hauling James through the gray. The knob scorched his glove. He kicked the door wider and cold hit like a thrown stone, biting lungs, slicing eyes, searing exposed skin with a clean, cruel edge that promised clarity or death depending on how a body met. He pivoted sideways to clear the jam with Eleanor in his arms, stepped onto the porch and dropped to a knee to shield her from wind-driven sparks. Max leapt past, landed in drifted powder, and whipped back to face the gap, barking at Nathan to move, at James to follow, at the world to widen enough for one more life to fit through. Nathan appeared at the threshold, blinking, coughing, sack clutched to his chest. Heat slapped him. He hesitated, looked back at the fire as if flames could sign a will. A beam groaned and dropped behind him. He lunged, stumbled over the shattered lantern, caught himself, shoved past a splintered post and tumbled into the snow. James didn't waste breath on him. He carried Eleanor down the steps, boots plunging, calf deep, thigh deep, until he found firm crust in the lee of a drift, and set her against a propped pack. Max pressed close to her shoulder, head low, breaths fast, eyes on James. "Stay with us," James said to Eleanor, rubbing her hands, pressing warmth into fingers that kept trying to curl to bone. He pulled the spare wool from his pack and wrapped it around her, then stripped his own outer mitts, to cradle her cheeks and checked her pupils again through smoke-salted tears. Her gaze focused on his mouth, then on Max, and held. The cabin exhaled flame from every seam. The chimney howled. Boards shrieked as pitch ignited inside old grain, a sound like sap screaming. Sparks went into the treetops and died as snow filled them dull. Nathan staggered up, coughing, eyes streaming, and lurched toward the clearing, looking for air, looking for the sack he had refused to drop, still clutched against his ribs like a life raft full of holes. He turned once as if to run back, then stared, understanding too late that the room he had ruled would collapse without giving anything back. He stumbled away, fell to his knees, crawled, rose, vanished into the white, leaving a scrawl of footprints that the wind started erasing immediately. James focused on the living. He loosened the blanket a fraction to keep Eleanor breathing, whispered that she was safe, that help would come, that heat and food waited at another hearth that did not know locks. Her lips moved around a word that might have been Tom. Max leaned into her shoulder and gave one small determined whine, then looked at James with an expression that felt like an order, and a thank you in one. Fire threw waves of heat that fought the gale. Snow hissed where cinders landed. The roof caved along the ridge with a soft final slump. For a moment, the clearing existed as a ring of light inside a blizzard, two worlds grinding against each other while three hearts beat in the seam between. James lifted Eleanor again, tucked the wool tight and nodded to Max. The dog trotted ahead, not running, pausing every few strides to confirm position, to keep the corridor through blowing white open with sound and motion. Behind them the cabin roared, devouring wood, pictures, jars, letters, old laughter, old harm, everything that could burn. Ahead waited a night colder than any hour James had lived, but also air that did not poison and snow that did not chain. He stepped into that cold with his burden and his partner, feeling the stark rightness that comes when a decision and a duty are the same thing, and he did not look back. Snow slashed across the clearing while orange light from the burning cabin pulsed behind them. James knelt by a drift, propped Eleanor against his pack and pulled wool around her shoulders until only a pale oval showed. Max pressed along her side, sharing heat, chest rising quickly but steadily, amber eyes flicking between her face and James's hands. When he tucked an edge under her chin, his glove brushed a hard ridge sewn into the inner lining. He slid two fingers beneath frayed stitching and found a wrapped packet, thin as a palm, sealed with twine and a strip of wax stamped by an old brass coin. He looked at Eleanor. Her eyes tracked the movement, then closed as if bracing for cold that had nothing to do with weather. He cupped the packet inside his coat to shield it, then lifted it where she could see. Eleanor's lips moved around a name shaped by years. Thomas. The syllables broke like ice, tender and sharp. James felt a hollow open in his chest as if the storm had reached inward and scooped out breath. He thumbed the wax, recognized the coin's faint profile, and understood that opening this thing would open something else. "I'll keep it safe," he said. She tipped her head the smallest degree toward Max, then back to the packet. He slid the twine free, peeled cloth from paper browned at the folds, and found a deed written in tight ink that refused to fade. The county seal bruised one corner. At the bottom ran signatures Thomas Ashford, witnessed by a notary and a woman named Eleanor Hart. Attached by a rusted clip lay a letter in his uncle's hand, the same leaning script that had labeled jars and fences, talking in plain sentences about land, trust, a debt no time could cancel, and a promise to hold everything until two people could stand under one roof without fear. "Dear Ellie," it began, "if I fail, the cabin and the north meadow are yours in full. If I return, they are ours. If neither is possible, the man carrying this will know what to do." Eleanor closed her eyes and a line of relief softened her mouth. Not joy, not victory, something like air reaching a room sealed too long. Max nosed her knuckles, then rested his chin across her wrist, anchoring present to past with quiet weight. James looked from the letter to the woman and felt the ground tilt under a history he had never heard. Uncle Thomas, the grin in every photograph, the steady hand behind the will that had given him shelter, had loved this woman with a devotion large enough to move land across years. War had intervened. The paper had tried to bridge the absence. Fear had nailed shut a door that should have stayed open. "He waited for you," James said, voice roughened by smoke and revelation. Eleanor's eyes opened. She watched the letter as if it were a fire she could warm herself by without touching. He left to serve, she whispered, each word a step over broken ground. When news came back wrong, his brother claimed the land and sent me away. I kept the paper because love told me he was alive somewhere. Then time started eating everything. Nathan learned there was value hidden in old deeds. He turned kindness into a chain. Max shifted to block a gust and leaned harder into Eleanor's side, and James watched that small pressure change her breathing. James slipped the deed into a dry bag and tucked it inside his shirt. Eleanor coughed, a thin voltage that shocked her frame, and he lifted a canteen for another sip. She swallowed, eyes never leaving his. "You have Thomas's jaw," she said, and smiled, a ghost of affection that broke him open. He felt grief arrive unstoppably, not only for a man he missed, but for years stolen from two people who had built futures in their heads and never got to walk in. "We'll honor this," he said. "We'll set it right in daylight with witnesses and law, not shadows." Gratitude flickered across Eleanor's features and settled like a candle behind thin skin. Behind them, the cabin threw up a last tower of sparks and slumped inward. A gust drove embers into the snow, and they died with a long sigh. He read the letter again, moving his lips without sound. At the margin, his uncle had drawn a clumsy heart and written two crooked initials, the kind of mark a man makes when he is halfway between embarrassment and pride. James laughed once through tears he did not hide. "He'd have hated that I'm crying," he said. Eleanor's mouth shaped a shape like yes. "He cried over you," she said, and closed her eyes as if memory had stepped near enough to touch. James slid a spare liner under Eleanor's feet and worked circulation into her toes. "Lost love," he said quietly, not as a phrase, as a diagnosis. "Not lost," she corrected and tapped the spot over his heart with a finger that weighed almost nothing. "Delay." He looked toward the tray line where dark trunks made a solemn congregation, and for a second, he imagined Thomas standing there in his patched coat, grinning that shameless grin, telling him to stop thinking and start acting. He checked the sky, judged the wind's turn, and listened for groans from branches that announce when loads shift. The storm was tiring, morning would come. He packed the letter back into the dry bag and zipped it under his base layer. "You're coming home," he told Eleanor. "You're home." She took a breath that sounded like ground thought. "I knew he'd send someone kind," she said. "I didn't expect he'd send kin." The word struck with the force of lineage. He had come here to erase noise, to step away from duty until it quit chasing him through sleep. Instead, he had stepped into the continuation of a promise bigger than any uniform. Max glanced toward the north and then back, as if to say the way forward remained the same, even though everything had changed. Eleanor found the dog's ear and rubbed where the fur grew. "Good guardian," she murmured. The shepherd closed his eyes for a second and leaned into the touch. The wind calmed another degree. James lifted Eleanor, checked the wrap around her wrist, tightened the blanket and felt her trust settle against his shoulder without fear. Ahead waited a cabin that carried Thomas's smell in the beams, and Thomas's laugh in the crooked window, and now Eleanor's name written into its legal bones. Max took 2 steps, looked back to confirm both followed, and padded into the whitening dark as if escorting a vow from one century to another. He studied the signatures again, felt history settle with undeniable clarity, and realized the man who taught him kindling also taught him without saying it how to keep. Eleanor's fingers curled around his sleeve with frail strength, gratitude flowing through that small grip like warmth through frost. Max steadied them both, a living bond between yesterday and tomorrow, and the three faced the night with a single purpose stitched through separate lives at last. Dawn thinned the storm until gusts sounded like tired lungs, and James, kneeling by Eleanor, judged that the wind would carry sound cleanly across the ridges. He loaded 3 cartridges with methodical hands, lifted the rifle toward a patch of pale sky and spaced the report sequence the way old field manuals taught for distress. 1 shot, pause to listen, a second, another measured breath, a third that cracked across the valley like a thrown stone. Max flinched at the first blast and then planted himself beside Eleanor, head low, body pressed to her ribs, eyes fixed on James as if holding him on task. After a quiet stretch that felt longer than it was, he sent another series, then a final pair to bracket the call. A muted echo rolled back from timber and rock. Minutes later, faint at first, a whistle answered from somewhere down the drainage, a rising 2-tone peal that didn't belong to wind. James lit a smoke canister from his pack, punched it into a drift and watched a column of orange thread climb through the pale. He unrolled a bright panel and stretched it flat on the snow, anchoring the corners with axe, kettle and a canvas roll. Eleanor's pulse ticked stronger against his glove after broth and sips of water. Her lips colored though exhaustion kept pulling her eyelids closed. "Hold on," he told her. "Help's coming." Max pricked his ears and swung his head toward the trees as voices worked their way through the hush. Then shapes appeared, 2 rangers in green shells and snowshoes, faces raw with cold rifles slung, medpacks strapped high. Rangers, the lead called, breath fogging, eyes scanning the burned cabin, the shattered lock, the makeshift sled tracks. "Who fired?" "I did," James answered, standing with palms open, then pointing to Eleanor. "Elder, hypothermic, dehydrated, wrist lacerated from restraint, smoke exposure. Captor fled downslope 10 minutes ago carrying a canvas sack." The second ranger crouched by Eleanor slid gloved fingers to the carotid, checked capillary refill and passed a small finger pulse oximeter to the first. "SPO 268, shallow," she said. "Airway patent, diminished breath sounds, likely inhalation injury. We need a bird." The lead keyed a radio. "Dispatch Granite 2 confirmed victim alive, critical, request medevac to clearing grid Sierra North 7, winds calm enough for hover." Static crackled, then a clipped affirmative. "We also have an arson scene," James said, gesturing to the smoking ruin. "Imminent collapse prevented interior sweep. Evidence of unlawful restraint in the back room." "Copy," the lead answered, already sliding a foil blanket under Eleanor and tucking chemical warmers along axillary and groin lines. "Name?" "Eleanor Hart," James. "I found her locked to a bed." She identified the man as Nathan, her nephew. At the name the ranger's jaw set. "We've had complaints about him skimming the elder's property. Nothing Max leaned nearer as the woman ranger fit a mask over Eleanor's face and breathed oxygen from a small cylinder into a clear bag. Eleanor stirred, eyes fluttering. "You're safe," the ranger said, voice calm. "I'm Dana." "Squeeze my fingers." Thin pressure closed around Dana's gloved hand. "Good," Dana said, nodding. "Let's prep an LZ." James and the lead tamped a wider circle, stamping and shoveling to knock down crust. James laid the bright panel in the center and pinned it with stakes. "Pilot favors approaches from the south," the lead said, listening to a new thread of sound that grew from distant throb to distinct rotor beat. The helicopter came low over the ridge, white and red against the winter sky, rotors shearing spindrift into halo. It flared, nose up, settled into a hover that threw hard wind across the clearing and flattened tracks into ghosts. A crew chief leaned out, hand on the frame, headset gleaming. James lifted both arms overhead in a Y, then pointed downwind to steer the pilot's yaw. The machine drifted, adjusted and planted skids with a hiss. Snow became smoke around them. The crew chief and a flight medic hustled across with a litter and a red bag, crouched into the wind and slid to a stop beside Dana. "What've we got?" the medic shouted. "Elder female, prolonged confinement, exposure, probable smoke inhalation," Dana barked back. "Vitals trending up with O2 and warmers." "Copy," the medic said, checking pupils, listening with a stethoscope that squealed under rotor wash, then nodding. "We'll take." James had the deed packet ready in a zip bag. "This goes with her," he told the crew chief, voice steady. "Chain of custody matters. It links her to a lawful title and will protect her from the man who did this." The chief studied his face, then the bag, then tucked it into a labeled pouch. "Logged," she said. "You coming?" James glanced at Max, who hadn't moved from Eleanor's side except to blink grit from his eyes. "I'll stay with the dog and assist ground units," he answered. Eleanor's hand searched the air. James bent close. "Ellie," he said softly, borrowing his uncle's name for her. "You're going to a hospital. I'll follow when the rangers clear the scene." Her mouth tried a smile. "Thomas," she whispered. Then he squeezed once, promise in pressure, and stepped back as they loaded her. Spine secured, straps snug, mask sealed. IV started, litter clipped to rails. Procedure rendered chaos into sequence. The crew chief signaled. The pilot pulled. The helicopter rose, swung its nose and carved away down the drainage, shrinking to a red bead, then to a hum in the bones. The sudden quiet after rotor thunder felt enormous. Max stared after the helicopter until it vanished, then looked at James as if the next task now owned them. Have you ever found purpose in saving another? The question stood in the clean air like a post. James felt the answer settle in him with weight and warmth. Yes. Again, the lead ranger, badge reading K. Alvarez, pointed down a line of churned snow. Suspect tracks head northeast toward the county road, Alvarez said. We'll cut him off at the creek. You up for a flank? James nodded. He's injured, smoke exposed, carrying a sack. Greed slows people. Alvarez cracked a grin. True enough. Bert, you take our friend here on the left bank. I'll swing right. Max trotted at James's knee as they moved into the trees. Boots landed in rhythm. Radios clicked. Breath timed with stride. Soon the tracks slid, staggered, straightened, then veered, as if Nathan had changed his mind twice in 100 yards. They found him at the creek ford, kneeling on the ice, one hand in the water, the sack clutched against his chest like a baby. He looked up, face gray with ash and strain. Stay where you are, Alvarez called. Stance textbook, hand near holster, but weapon undrawn, hands visible. Nathan lifted both hands slowly, sack dangling from one wrist. I didn't hurt her, he rasped. You chained her, James said, voice flat. Nathan's eyes flicked to Max, then to the badge. It's complicated, he muttered, but the wind carried away the excuse. Turn around, Alvarez said, stepping forward. Cuffs ready. On your knees, interlace fingers behind your head, Alvarez ordered. The deed we logged ties title to Eleanor, adding fraud. Nathan obeyed. Metal cuffs clicked. The arrests. Months later the mountains wore green shoulders and a sky the color of enamel. Snowmelt braided the creek, ravens argued from the timber, and Thomas's old cabin looked less like a refuge against storms and more like a place built for staying. New sills, straightened rafters, fresh chinking, and a chimney that no longer leaned proved the work that filled long days. Inside, light curled across a pine floor and found a rocker, Eleanor claimed after morning stretches with a stubborn smile. Her hands, once raw from iron cuffs, learned softness again through knitting, letter writing, and coaxing bread to rise. Rehab had rebuilt breath and balance, Will did the rest. The wrist scar stayed, a pale bracelet that reminded her bones they had outlived the room that tried to keep them. Max lay beside her chair with the focus of a sentinel off duty yet never lax, escorting every step, stopping when she stopped so neither felt alone. James moved around them with steadiness that surprised him. Coffee hissed, sourdough cracked, boots thumped in and out carrying split rounds that smelled like sun. Chores no longer felt like camouflage for emptiness, they served something. He repaired the fence, mended the springhouse roof, planted raspberries along the lane, and tuned the old radio so it found music through static. At dusk the three sat at the table under lamplight while the wind thinned to a hush outside. James listened and felt grief slide into gratitude, the way snowmelt slides into rivers and keeps moving. Law turned forward too. The deed became more than. In town, a lawyer with a cedar desk drafted papers that took the letter's promise and gave it bones. A trust named the Ashford Heart Foundation. Assets were plain in lists, yet powerful in practice. Timber royalties redirected from probate, proceeds from auctions of items Nathan had hoarded, a modest insurance payout after the arson case closed, and gifts that arrived with notes saying keep doing good. The charter broke help into three streams. First came the cabin and meadow, protected so no one would sell the heart to save the hands. Second came a veterans peer circle at the clinic with travel vouchers, a counselor 2 afternoons a week, and a tool bench for quiet fix. Third came the shelter 2 towns over, where Max's story had become a poster taped near the door. Kennels got heated floors, a washer that didn't die mid-cycle, and training so anxious dogs could show their best selves on hard days. Paperwork 8 hours without apology, and James didn't resent a minute. Bylaws, bank forms, bylaws again, and an annual plan that looked like a map he could fold and tuck in a pocket. Eleanor kept meetings honest by asking only what mattered. Whom are we missing? How will this help today and not just tomorrow? Does the language sound like people or like paper? Max attended every session and solved tension by rolling onto his back exactly when debate sharpened, which made everyone laugh and vote yes on kindness. Work braided itself with small joy. A neighbor carved a sign for the lane, another delivered a sack of nails and refused to take money. The pilot from the medevac wrote a postcard from a distant canyon with a sketch of a helicopter shaped like a beetle. On Saturdays, volunteers came up the track with lumber, paint and gossip. By supper time, the porch rail would stand straighter, the shed door would swing without shriek, and 3 extra dogs would thunder in circles until Max, acting like a magistrate, restored order with one look. Healing moved at the speed of steady attention. Eleanor's hair brightened, her cheeks warmed, and her laugh gained a little trill at the end that turned heads in town. She needed rest after the effort, but pride replaced shame when folks asked about the scar. She called it a receipt the world had to accept before it could sell her harm again. James slept more deeply. Nightwatch in his head relaxed its grip because purpose stood guard outside and didn't need constant relief. He still counted exits without thinking, still noticed shadows that didn't belong, but he no longer mistook quiet for threat. When the clinic circle met beneath a cottonwood, he spoke first to make space for silent, shy voices. "I fix what I can reach," he said, and set a broken reel on the table so hands could start while words found courage. Later, a man brought coffee tins full of screws for the shed because sorting saved his evenings from drifting. A woman left a stack of resumes she had printed for people who didn't have printers, saying, "Use what you need." The shelter crew visited with a hound whose fear made him shrink from touch. Eleanor sat on the floor and told a story about Thomas building a sled with a crooked runner and loving it anyway. Max flanked the hound like a wall that asked nothing. The dog inched forward and went to sleep with his head on Eleanor's shoe. Some days need an apology rather than try. On the first farmer's market of summer, the foundation table sat beside jars of honey and quilts folded like sunsets. James forgot the cash box, then laughed when 3 different neighbors pressed small bills into his palm with grins that said he had already been paid in pies and post holes. They sent rescue grants to a town downriver after flooding, packed care kits for dogs whose people camped in cars, and stocked the clinic's break room with peppermints because a nurse mentioned they help when grief tries to climb your throat. Now and then, news came down from the courthouse like weather. Nathan pled to charges and signed away claims with a hand that shook. The court ordered restitution to the trust and barred him from managing anyone's money for a very long time. No speeches followed. Dignity works best when quiet. One evening, thunder rolled along the ridge and rain walked across the meadow in sheets. James set cups while Eleanor lit a candle before a photograph of Thomas and touched the frame with 2 fingers, a habit halfway between salute and pray. Max checked windows, sighed, and sprawled across the threshold like a warm plank. The room smelled of stew, wet wool, and lemon oil rubbed into the rocker's arms. James unfolded the original letter and read the crooked heart again. Sorrow arrived, sat like an old friend, ate a little and left, making room for gratitude to stretch its legs. They kept promises without fuss, a woodpile for an elder whose back refused to lift rounds, a ride for a vet to a hearing, a sack of kibble with a note that said repayment equals passing kindness forward. When strangers asked how to help, James pointed to lists that contained reachable tasks. When friends asked why, Eleanor said, "Because someone once held a door for us in a blizzard, and we learned what home meant." Max herded people gently toward those doors and checked that they latched behind them. By autumn, asters painted the ditch, and the night smelled faintly of frost again. The porch welcomed laughter from folks who stayed past sunset, and the sign at the lane, Ashford Heart Foundation, looked like it had always belonged there. The foundation filed its first report at the library and tucked a copy into a binder on the cabin shelf. Numbers tallied dollars and miles, but the line that mattered most simply counted returns, people who came back. At dusk they set 3 mugs on the steps and watched deer step from the shadows. The talk every evening sounded like planning more than confession. Letters from donors filled a shoebox, many with shaky penmanship that said simply, "Keep going." Once a month they drove to the hospital to visit the flight medic who had taken Eleanor that first day. Every visit ended with a hug that felt like tying a knot that never slipped. On the first snow of the new season, fat flakes fell without wind, covering fences in clean lines. James banked the stove, Eleanor lit a candle in front of Thomas's picture, and Max stationed himself at the door to track what the night delivered. Warmth expanded from the stove to their hands, to the calm that settles when an address finally feels earned. James looked at the deed on the shelf and understood it kept paying dividends they hadn't listed: safety, belonging, continuity. Eleanor held his arm and whispered, "Home," and the word didn't echo, it landed. They had taken a loss and turned it into shelter. They had taken a dog's insistence and turned it into a map. They had taken signatures and turned them into held lives. If James, Eleanor, and Max's story of loyalty and redemption moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Like, comment, and subscribe to join our family of storytellers. Your next tale of courage awaits.